Hi, I'm Jill from KiteCo.Creates, and I'm so happy to be bringing the pattern for our JayMarie to you. I designed this bag because I'm sick of my bag falling over, and I wanted a bag that would just sit, just slouch and sit, and that she does. The next thing I wanted to do was have a bag I could easily access while it stood up, and I didn't have to fumble around looking for things while I was holding up my bag. So these are two reasons why we suggest making the bag out of a softer, more supple fabric so that it will sit. It still looks awesome in a vinyl or a heavier fabric, just doesn't quite have that slouchability. So the 3D pockets are not just for looks, they work, they're functional. Now there is another option for pockets, and it doesn't have the gusset, so it's a little bit simpler if you wanted to start easy. Now it has a full overlay pocket at the back. Template and SVGs are included. Strap options, as you can see, we have different strap options. So this one here is a simple shoulder strap. That becomes part of the bag construction, and so there's no need to make a separate strap when you finish the bag. That comes in a crossbody and a shoulder length. If you want a standard strap, that simply comes into a ring and you add your crossbody or your shoulder strap as you normally would, and all those details are in the pattern. Now, because there's so many different options, we've done a cutting chart. Now it's detailed what you swap out and what you need to cut for each individual option. Now for the great news, this bag does not have binding, nor does it have a drop-in lining. I know I can hear the applause from here, but hey, because of that, the construction method is a little bit different. So we've set the rating at an intermediate sew. But if you're a confident beginner who's wanting to skill up and learn some new techniques, I'm sure you could handle this. But as this is a sewing tutorial, we shall get on with that now. So I hope you enjoy watching it, and I'm sure it will help and give you some assistance in making your own JayMarie. So we'll quickly run through the pieces as they're ready to sew. So we've got our pattern piece A, the body, 2 exterior and 2 lining. The exterior has medium weight interfacing and very lightweight fusible fleece. Now this is kept out of the seam allowance. Then we've got our lining, and they're both got medium weight interfacing on them as well. Now our pocket pieces, we have 2 exterior. They have medium weight interfacing. The lining does not. Neither does the B1 or 2, which are the zip edge and the pocket gusset. Now this bag doesn't have to have a contrast, but I think it's quite nice to add a bit of interest to the front, especially with the pockets. Then we have our pattern C, which is our zip tabs. Now I like these in a contrast to match the pockets. Medium weight interfacing on all of these, exterior and lining. Now our gusset panel. Now the exterior has medium weight interfacing and fleece. Now these need to be cut to length as mentioned in the cutting chart, because the lining and the exterior are different lengths. There is information for that as well as the fleece in the cutting chart. Now the PH is just the strap connector. Now I'm using a H1 and a H2 because I'm doing the simple strap. So I've cut an exterior and a contrast for each of these, and there is a fusible fleece pattern that goes with these. So the details of what you cut for which different strap are all clearly laid out in the cutting chart. But do keep the fleece out of the seam allowances on those. The same with our G, our PG. Make sure that interfacing and fleece is out of the seam allowances on this piece, because it gets quite thick when we want to top stitch it. So we're going to start with our pockets. So we want our 2 20 centimeter 8-inch zips and 2 of our B1 pieces. Now lay them right sides together and clip them along one edge of the zip. Now it is interesting to note we do need our zips pulling, opening and closing in the opposite direction, so they need to be mirrored. So keep that in mind. So fold that out away from the zip and finger press it open. Now we want to turn it over and fold that little edge in towards the edge of the zip so that we can basically turn it over above the zip. So either finger press that or iron it in place, and then just put it over the edge of the zip. We're basically binding the end of this little piece of zip. We wanted to stitch along each of those at a 6mm seam from the edge. So 6mm, 1/4 inch from the edge. Now make sure you catch the back in that. Then we want to take our two B2 pieces, lie the zipper pull to the middle. Now you notice mine are opposite sides, and fold that over. So the binding is in the middle of the B2 and the zipper pull is in the middle. Now make sure they are mirrored so that you've got them going opposite ways. It's quite good to put an owl in the corner there and just fold it over so it keeps it nice and flat. Now this is one of those points that if you've got a wide zip, it could be a little bit short or it could be a little bit long. You might need to trim it. Just don't trim your zipper. So sew those at a 6mm, 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then we just want to open them out, but I would trim the corners slightly first. So open them out. Then we want to line up the long raw edges of the B2. So just clip along the raw edges. And we're basically wanting to top stitch down that little seam next to the zip and baste around the rest of the B2. Trim any overhang and neaten it up. So make sure these are opening to opposite ends. So we want to take our two B pieces and we want to line up the pocket zipper panel with the raw edges right sides together. So start at the bottom and make sure the join where the zip meets the gusset is lined up with the one notch indicated on the panel piece. So start at the bottom and work your way around the curve. Sew those with a 3mm seam. Use an owl to keep it in place around the corner. It can be a little bit tricky. So I lost some footage again, so I've substituted an old piece in here. So we're going to put our lining on our pockets now. So we want to squash down the gusset that we've just added so that we can place our pocket lining right sides together. So pin around the edge, line everything up. It does get a little bit tricky on the corner, so it can be easier if the zip is open so that you can flatten it out as you go around the corner. So we're going to sew around these pieces with a generous 3mm, 1/8 inch, so a little bit more than 3mm, but not as much as 6. Okay, now we just turn that through. Put a little pressure around the corner to flatten it all out and make sure the lining is well back. Now we're wanting to pin this in place so that we can run a top stitch around here. So it can be easier to open up your zipper a little bit so that you can get some pins in there and really pressure it out at the corner. So press that back as much as you can at the back so that it's nice and straight and doesn't sneak up in your seam. So it's a bit tricky to hold these all out flat while we stitch along there at a top stitch. Now a 3mm is a little bit fast, so fairly close, but enough to make it a nice clean top stitch. And we want to repeat that with our other pocket. So now we need to sew our darts. So we've cut the pattern with the darts included. So we fold along the dart line exactly as it is cut, pin it in place, and what we're wanting to do is sew parallel to that cut, to the end of the cut at 3mm or 1/8 inch, and then veer off the end and back stitch. So do that for all your darts individually, like the exterior separately from the lining. Now we want to take our pocket guide that we have, lay that over your exterior, lining up the darts and the little notches, and draw around the edge of it with an air erasable marker. Don't use anything that's not going to come off. Now we want to line our pockets up just exactly on that line. Now I use pins to pin it in place. So I start on both straight ends and work in towards the curve. Now we're going to sew around the edge fairly close to the edge of the pocket, but in enough to secure the pocket. I think 3mm is a little bit too far, so get it fairly close. Yep, and so you've got your pocket stitched like that on your front exterior. And then we'll do our other pocket exactly the same. It's easier to do one at a time so that you're keeping it separate. It gives you more room. Make sure your seam on the point 1 lines up perfectly in the middle. So that's our pockets all done. Now we're going to put our bag tag on if you're using a bag tag. Now we are going to stitch along the top, so we don't want it too close to the top. So I come down 4 centimeters or 1.5 inches, mark that point. Fold it in half, it's much easier to get a center line. I just mark through my washer and cut my holes with a craft knife. Which blade really needs a new blade? It's getting quite blunt. Now secure the back of your prongs because you don't want them marking or pushing any pressure on the lining of the bag. Okay, so we want to make sure we do our darts. You can either do them before the badge or after. So do the darts in the body. So again, do them like you did in step 1. Fold exactly on that fold line on all the darts. Now the fleece is out of the dart, so that's not going to get too thick. Sew those in place. And trim up your ends. So now we want to do our pleats so that the pocket lies flat. So the easiest way to do that is to put an owl right next to your zipper teeth and just fold it over. But make sure the folds are within the zipper, not the fabric. And then it's much thinner and it'll lie much flatter. Trim off any ends that you might have, cottons and things hanging over the end. Clip that in place. Do that at the other side as well, ensuring that the folds are in the zipper, not the fabric. This can get quite bulky, so if it is in the fold is in the fabric, it just gets a little bit too thick. So line up your darts, but nest them so that some are lying one way and others the other. It keeps it a little bit flatter and less bulk. So at the bottom, pinch the seam and just fold it over to lie just about 3 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch, short of where the pocket joins. Just like that. And do that on the other side as well. So we're pinching the very seam and just lying it just short of the seam. Now baste that in place so nothing moves. Now it is wanting to pull back at the back, so make sure it's clipped well in place. Go steady on this at the top if you're on a domestic machine. It is going over the zipper, and if need be, just hand crank it at the top. You don't want any broken needles. Just maybe pay attention to what needle size you're using for thicker bits. A thicker needle is always better when you've got bulky seams. That's our pockets all done, and our bag front is complete. So put that aside for now, and we're going to work on our back overlay. There's so many different ways of doing zipper overlays, and if you do yours differently, please do what you're comfortable with. So I'm going to go with the one pocket section. So what we're going to do is find our halfway point. We're going to measure down 4 centimeters, 1.5 inches from the top of the curve, and tape our overlay in place. So I just run double-sided tape. Now use a thin double-sided tape and put it out of where your seam allowance will be. Now the file for the zipper overlays is included with the pattern pieces, and there's 2 choices, a rounded one and quite a square edge, so choose which one you want. Line that up and push it in place. Now we're going to stitch around the edge of that. I think 3mm is too far, so really close to the edge, evenly around the edge. Okay, I had an import issue with this piece of file. Never mind, we'll do this again. I've cut out the fabric within the box of my overlay. Just don't cut your overlay. And I've trimmed the fleece right back to the edge. Now we're going to take our zipper and our pocket lining. So lay them both the right way up, so both facing upwards, and clip along the top. Now stitch along here at a 3mm stitch. 3mm, 1/8 of an inch. This is just to hold it in place. Now we're wanting to get a bit of thin, probably 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch double-sided tape. Lie that along the top. Now always take it too far. It's best if it's like within it, maybe 1 inch in from the ends, but I always have to pull some away later. So line up your center marks on your pocket and your exterior, and so that the pocket's in the middle. Now we're going to stitch from before that line and end at the other line. Now stitching along the bottom of the hole only. Now I leave long tails at this point so that I can tie them off and keep it neat with one seam, but you can back stitch if you prefer. Now I use an L because it tends to want to go down into the hole where we've cut, and it keeps it all nicely in place. So tie those off at the back. Flip that over. Right, so that's what you've got. So if we flip it upwards, we want to fold the pocket lining down and just finger press it in place. And we're wanting to get some double-sided tape just underneath the tape, the zip at the top, so that half is above the zip and half is catching the zip. Now don't take it right to the edge. Again, maybe keep it 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters within the zip, because you'll need to sew down the edge of your pocket later. So flatten that down and bring the bottom of that pocket up to sit on top of the tape and press it in place. It's a good idea to pin the bottom of the pocket in place here, because we're going to sew around from the seam where we stopped around the rest of the box, joining in the last seam and catching all of that in the back. So there's lots of different methods, as I said, so just choose which one works best for you with these zipper overlays. So pull those through and tie them off. So now we just have to close up our pocket on the inside. So, and then start there with a zipper foot, go straight down and veer off to be within your seam allowance at the bottom. So we just fold the exterior back so that we can access that without catching our lining. So that's all done, trimmed up at the back. So all that's left to do on our exterior now is our darts. So we do those the same as we have with our other darts. Fold along our line, put pins in or clips in, so parallel at 3mm and off at the edge. And that is our back exterior all complete. So put that aside for now. So now we want to take our exterior gusset. Now we're going to draw some lines here. from the end inwards. So the first line we're going to draw is in 70 millimeters or 2 3/4 inches, and the second line we're going to draw is 80 millimeters from the end or 3 1/8. So we're going to do that on both sides, and these will be referred to as the first and second line. So the one that's closest to the edge or the end will be the first, and the one further in will be the second. So do that on both ends. So the first line in is 70 millimeters or 2 3/4 inch, and the second is 80 millimeters or 3 1/8. So then we're going to take one of our exterior pieces. We can start, doesn't really matter which, but we can start with the back, and we're going to line the edge up with our first mark and clip that in place. Now the second mark is that's where we're going to stitch to, but to start with we're going to clip the marks, the end to the first mark. And then we're going to clip the middle and then work in between. So we just work our way around, clipping in place. Right, so that's all clipped in. Now we're going to sew around there from our second line. So start sewing at our second and end in our second. And we're going to sew at a 10 millimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then we want to take our front exterior and line that up in exactly the same way. So line the ends up with the first mark from the edge, same with the other side. So line the edge up with the first mark in the center as we did before. And just clip our way in between. Now when wanting to sew this the same, we want to start on the second line and end on the second line with a 10 mil or 3/8 inch seam allowance. So what we want to do now is clip on the second line. So that's where we stop stitching. So clip right on the line and just before your seam allowance. So don't go past the seam allowance in any direction. You're better to be slightly short than too far away. And the reason for this is very shortly we're wanting to go and stitch from our body up that seam onto the gusset. So repeat that on all 4 of these snips or on these lines. So ever so slightly short. Don't go that way and don't go inwards. Keep it as close as possible without cutting that stitch. So now we want to trim those seams, but we don't want to trim it right to the end, and we don't want to trim our darts. So trim in between the darts with pinking shears or just trim them back a little bit and stop 3 inches or so from the end. So just leave that at that end. So trim both sides. Right, so that's our exterior complete. Let's move on with our zipper panel. So we've got our 2 exterior and 2 lining. So we want to take one C piece, right side together with our zip, clip that in place, and baste that with a 3mm 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So now we want to turn that over and add our lining right side together. So if the zip wasn't there, both the fabrics would be right side together. Clip that in place. And stitch along there at a 6mm or 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now we want to open that out. Now this is fairly hard on the hands because it's a little bit firm. So force it back so it's nice and clean away from the zip. And just clip along the whole panel. So once it's all clipped in place, we want to sew along that edge or top stitch along the zipper edge with a 3mm 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so that's all done. Now we want to take our other exterior, right sides together with a zip, line up the edges with our other end that we've already got in place and clip it in place. And then just complete your zipper panel doing this side exactly what you've previously done on the other side. So baste this, flip it over and put the lining on and then top stitch. And that completes your zipper panel. Now we're going to do our interior or our lining slip pocket. Now you can either fold it shortways and have one pocket or lengthways and have 3 credit card slots. And we're going to stitch down one side along to the middle and leave a turning gap, pick it up again into the other side. Now we want to trim our corners so that we can turn that through. So turn it through the turning gap, making sure all your points are out nice and tight. I give it a bit of a press, right? So we're all ready to go. Now the markings for your credit card slots are in the pattern. So draw those out with an air erasable marker with the seam allowances at the sides and the bottom as well. So find the centers of your exterior panel and line it up, making sure that the turning gap is up nice and evenly. And place it 5 centimeters or 2 inches down from the top in the center. Now it does help to put some pins in here because you're going to be sewing these credit card slots in place. So we're going to follow our stitch line along, up, back, down, up and back, and follow those until our 3 credit slots are completed. Make sure you double back, do good back stitching at the tops of all of these. Okay, so that's our credit card slots all done. So now we want to do our darts. So do them exactly the same as the others. Make sure you line them up nice and straight. Now we're going to do a interior overlay zip pocket. Now you can do any kind of pocket you like. This one has to come down 5 centimeters or 2 inches from the center of the curve. And the only difference is we want to leave a turning gap in the side when we close it. So on our last side, sew a little bit at the beginning, leave a gap, and then sew up the rest. This is so we can close up the lining when we finished our bag. You could do a plain slip pocket on the back here or an inset pocket. You can really do whatever you like on these pockets. This just gives you an example or an idea. So that's our pocket all finished. Now it pays to open this pocket because we are going to be using it to turn the bag. So complete your darts the same as you have with all the others, following the line closely, clip them all in place. And that completes our back lining. So that's our lining front and back. Now we're going to find our gusset. We're going to draw marks on here like we did on our exterior. Now our first line will be 30 mils or 1 1/4 from the edge, and the second will be 40 mil or 1 1/2 from the edge. And if you haven't done so before, we also want to find the center point on our gusset. So just fold it in half and clip those centers. So do it on both edges. And we're almost ready to assemble our lining. And then we're going to do what we did with our exterior. We're going to line up the edge of the exterior, or the end of the top, with our first line, and do that on both sides, and then line up our center at the bottom again. And just clip our way around. I find it easier to start on the straight bits and then do the curve last. So again, when we start sewing on this piece, we want to start sewing at the second line and end at the second line from the end, like we did on our exterior. So we want to sew around there, starting at a 10mm 3/8 of an inch seam and tapering our way in to a couple of mil more, so that we want to make our lining a little smaller than our exterior so that it's not baggy. And again, we're stopping and starting on our second line from the end of the gusset like we did before. So as you can see, we've started at the normal seam allowance and tapered it down to be a wider one. So this is our last join on our lining. So we're going to clip our way around like we did with the other one. Join up our lines on the number 1 mark from the end like we did before. So we'll start here at the top with a 10mm 3/8 of an inch seam, and then taper our way down to be a few mil wider going down and at the bottom, so that but we do need to leave a turning gap of at least 20 centimeters in the bottom of this, or 20 centimeters. I think it's about 8 inches. So that's that all sewn. We've got our turning gap open. We want to keep it that way, and we've stopped and started at our second line. So we want to give that a bit of a trim with our pinking shears. So again, don't trim or cut the dart seams at the end, and I wouldn't trim the turning gap, just so that you can get a nice seam on it when you turn it over later. If you do, don't trim much off it. So be careful not to go too far, and don't get your finger at the back. I've done that before. And that is our linings all complete. So we're wanting to find the zipper panel that we completed earlier. Give it a bit of a trim up if it needs it. We're going to connect this to our lining section. So the first thing we need to do is find our centers. So fold it in half and do a little snip right through both layers, our exterior and our lining. Now find the center of your body and the center of your lining. Now line those up so that it's right side together. Put a couple of clips in the middle and then put a clip at the end of the gusset and the end of the zipper panel. Do that on both sides, just the lining on the zipper panel and the end of the gusset on the lining. Now we're going to clip in between. Now when you get to the point that you've made the snip back in step 4, what we want to do is lie the gusset down first. So lie that bit flat, pull that little bit that seems to be flapping in the breeze over the top, that bit there, and then just let the seam of the gusset sit up outwards from the panel. So you're going to stitch along there right to that point and continue up the gusset. So just clip all that in place, and we're going to do the same on the other side. So again, lay the gusset bit down flat first. So that's behind, and bring the body out over it. You might have to sort of pull it down a bit so that it lines up straight. And then we're just going to have that seam holding out. So from inside, it's going to be done so that it's got no puckers and no holes. See, it's just going to come to a nice point like that. So what we're going to do now is sew along that seam at a 10mm or 3/8 of an inch seam. So when you get to those points, pay special attention to sew exactly where the bottom of the snip is, so that you don't get a hole or any fraying. So when we pull that through, see, we've come right to the very point so that that seam is hanging loose, and on the inside we should have a nice point. It's good to check these now because it can be readily fixed now, but it's a bit difficult to do that later. So check the inside, make sure you've got no hole or any puckering. Now a slight bit of puckering is okay and probably safer than a hole. So what we're going to do is do the other side now. We're going to line up again like we did before, the center of the gusset with the center of the curve, and the end of the gusset with the end of the zipper panel, just the lining. And again, when we get to that point, lay the gusset down first and then put the body bit over the top of it like we did on the other side. This always wants to fall back, so I keep giving it a bit of a tap to hold it in place. So again, lay the gusset bit down. So see, that seam just goes completely straight from the inside, and then you're laying that over the top. Clip it in place, and again, sew that with a 10mm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Check your little points again to make sure you haven't missed anything. Now we're going to get our 2 PPG pieces. Now notice these are shaped, so we want the wider end to be lined up with the end of the zipper and gusset panel. So line them up centered and clip them in place. Now clip them through the exterior and the lining, so right through both sides there. If you need to trim that end first, do that. Now we're wanting to sew along here at a 6mm 1/4 inch seam allowance, but do go careful if you're on a domestic machine. So it's 6mm 1/4 inch, because you are sewing over your zipper tape, so be a little bit careful. Right, that's all done. So we need to trim that seam around our curve. So I do that with my pinking shears, but you can just cut little notches in towards the seam close together if you want to. We are going to top stitch this seam, so you do need a little bit of length, so don't cut it too short. So just trim around that curve. So just clip those PPGs open, because we're going to lay the exterior over the top of that shortly. Now if your seam allowance is sticking out a little bit, just give it a little bit of a trim too, so that it eases in nice and gently. So open your zipper here, because it's going to be a bit difficult to turn the bag later on if your zipper is closed. I usually do mine to about halfway, and I've got a pretty big zipper pull, so I've tucked that back inside. So now get your exterior. Now what you want to do is make sure you have the right side facing up. I put my zipper overlay pockets at the top on both the lining bit and the exterior, so that I know that the backs are going to be the right way up. So when you fold it like that, both of your zipper panels are going to be, or zipper overlays are going to be on the top. Now line up the center of your exterior zip with the exterior center point on your body. So you're pretty much doing the same as you did with the lining. Find the middle points and clip out there. And this time your gusset will come right to the end of the PPG that you sewed on earlier. Now with some fabrics this may be a little bit too long, like 1/4 inch, 6mm or so too long. If that's the case, you can trim it later, but it should be fine to work in. So center the gusset with the PPG, because you will shape that to be the same later. So make sure that's in the middle, and there's a little overhang on the gusset on each side. Now simply go along and clip exactly like you did before. When you get to the point, make sure the gusset bit's lying down flat and the body is over the top. So you've got that gusset seam just sitting loose. Now it does want to pull back down because it's quite heavy at this point, so just keep it, make sure that the zipper panel is nice and close in behind. Now don't stretch the zipper panel here, make sure there is quite a curve at the bottom, because don't forget you're stitching 10mm 3/8 inch in, so it is going to look a little bit gathered, but it won't when you stitch it. Line up the other side as well, line the center up, right sides together, remember, in the middle, and clip out from there. Again, when you get to your points, lay your gusset bit down and the body comes out over the top of that, and that little bit goes around the back. And because we've sewn our PPG through the lining and the exterior on the zipper tape, this seems a little trickier to sew because the seam seems to get in the way at the back. But don't worry, we'll just merge that into the seam and merge or slide off the seam. And I'll show you how to do that as we get to it. So first of all, mark 6 mil from each end on the side that you're going to sew. 6 mil or 1/4 of an inch from each end. It's easier to have that in place rather than thinking about something else. So we're going to start at that 6 mil, sew down there. Now as you can see, this seam here at the back seems to get in your way, so hold it back and sew off it at this end. So you're sewing down there and you're just going to let it merge off there, or let it slide off. So you'll catch the beginning of it and then slide it off. And on the other side, you can see, oh, I've caught that there. Hold it back till you get close to that seam and then let it merge in. So from the back it's easier to see. So you're wanting to just merge in on both ends. You can put a bit of double side tape, but I find that gets more confusing, so that you can actually stitch straight along there and don't pull it back too quickly. Just let it ease into your seam, or ease off your seam at each end. So that's all finished, so we'll just put that aside for one moment. So let's make our PPH. Now there's several options for the PPH, but we treat them all exactly the same in how we sew them. The only difference is the length. You can either use 2 PPH, which are shorter than these, but I'm using a PPH 1 and 2 because I'm using a simple strap option. So we simply clip them around the edges, around the curve, but we don't close up the little straight edge, we leave that open. So for the thin strap we need to use the normal PPH, and for the shoulder strap, simple shoulder strap, we use a PPH 1 and 2, and for the simple crossbody strap we use 2 PPH 3s. So they're just longer. So we sew all the way around the edge at a 6mm seam allowance, leaving the little end open. Do both of those, and then we're going to turn them through. But before we do, it's a good idea to trim the end. Just trim around the curve. I use my pinking shears for this, or you can cut little snips or little V's in them if you want to, because we do want these to lie flat so that we can top stitch around them. The PPH is a strap connector, whereas the PPH 1, 2 and 3 turn into being actually straps. So if you're using the simple strap option, you don't need to make an extra strap. If you're using the PPH, you'll then need to use a thin strap. So we've sewn those. Now we want to top stitch around the edge at 3mm or 1/8 of an inch. Now if you're using the PPH, just do the 3mm. If you're using 1, 2 or 3, do a second row of stitching at 6mm, so it gives us a double top stitch, and that looks really cool. Right, what we're going to do now is slide these into the open end of the PPG. Now we want to make sure we've got it lying up the right way if you've used a contrast. So if you open up the little end, make sure you're putting the contrast right side together with the contrast. So you can see I've got the blue there at the top, so I've got that laying upwards at the top. You might get your hand inside to pull these in, it can be a bit tricky. Make sure the end is nice and level. Just check you've got it the right way up and pin those in place. So what we wanted to do is start stitching at that where we stopped and across the end and back down. Now you can do a couple of stitches down either side and across just to reinforce that, because this is holding your strap in place, and feed the longer one in the other end. And line it up, and again clip it in place, and we're going to sew from the seam to the seam at a 6mm or 1/4 of an inch, which is why we stopped at the end, because we are going to trim our corners on these. You can go down a little bit if you want to reinforce. So we've got those in place, so we want to trim the edges a little bit and the corners. Don't take the very end too short because you don't want that to pull out later. So this is where the fun begins. We're going to turn our bag now. So we simply slide our hand in the end where we left the turning hole and push the other end into our hand so that we can start pulling it through. It's not a big hard turn by any means, but do be a little bit gentle. Get the straps through and the zipper panels, but don't pull on anything. I like to get my hand in and just force those corners out as well on the bottom of the bag so they're nice and rounded. All right. So this gets a bit tricky. Now we want to make sure this is separate. We want to get both of those seams lying down towards the bag. So that's the seams along the curve. So you might need to get your finger inside and make sure they're lying towards the bottom of the bag. You can feel when they're up in the zipper panel. So make sure they're lying down and pin them in place. We're going to top stitch along here, so you really got to get it flat, else it looks a little bit strange. It is a bit fiddly and it's a bit time consuming, this job. So just make sure it goes right up into that corner where the gusset meets, into that point, and that it's all lying down into the body. Right, that's all that done. Now the easiest way to get your machine in here if you're on a domestic is to take your bead off if it comes off so that you've got your free arm. Now some of the testers have done this on an industrial. I think it's just a bit tricky to get in to start with, but you can get in over the gusset bit. This is one of those areas that I think will be very tricky if you have chosen to use a thicker fabric, which I really don't suggest for this bag. So you're wanting to sew at 3 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch below that seam. So you are stitching on the body of the bag, not the zipper panel. Now just jump over the gusset while it's under there, but back stitch at the gusset. You are stopping when it reaches the point of the gusset. So that's holding your lining in place, or else the baggy lining would be horrendous. Clip up any loose ends you've got. Is reach into the overlay pocket. Now we did leave the turning hole in the side, and grab the bottom lining of the bag. So the turning hole we used, pull that out through the overlay pocket in the bag. And get it to the point where you can find your seam and line up your center points in the seam. And we're going to sew this at the same seam width that you ended and started with. Now we were a little bit more than a 1 centimeter 3/8 of an inch at the bottom of the bag for the lining. So start where you stopped and sew along to the other edge. And trim this up with some pinking shears. Don't trim your darts again because we don't want them darts coming undone. So now we want to push that pocket, well, good idea to trim any ends while you're open. Push that pocket down back into the bag. Get the lining all flat inside. And now pull out the zipper overlay pocket lining. So that's the joint, the opening we just pulled the lining through. Now it's easier if you turn that completely flat. Pinch the seams together and clip those in place. Now you can either close this up by hand, or you can just run a little fine seam along the edge, which is what I'm going to do. Just make sure you definitely catch both edges. Yep, sew down there, very close to the end, or the edge I should say. Right, that's all done. Trim up any loose ends and push our pocket back in where it belongs. So that's our bag all closed up. No holes left. It's a good idea to put some pressure in there to get the corners out. Right, now we've just got our strap. Now these PPG pieces can be a bit fiddly to try and turn right out, so make sure the edges are as far out as you can get them. Now if your machine can cope with it, it is nice to top stitch around those, or you can just put some rivets in later when you connect your strap. But it is good to have some reinforcing on that piece. And same with the other side. So if you've used the PPH, you'll just have two short pieces here, not the longer pieces like I've got. Just roll the edges and get those corners out nice and firm. I put a pin in the middle just to keep them in place for now. So if you're using the PPH, you just simply get a ring, slide it on the end like that, about 2 inches, 5 centimeters above, and simply put a rivet through both pieces right through the PPG. Now I've put 4 rivets in those because they do look quite cool. But with a simple strap, we're simply going to put a couple of rings over that end. Now I fold it out over the strap because I like to see the contrast on the outside. And you simply add 2 rivets in there, or you can sew a little box if you just want to secure it. Now this is our glide, so I'm going to iron that in place. It makes it so much easier. So I fold it in half and fold it in half again to the middles. Now we want to open that out and put it right sides together and line up the short edges. Just clip that in place. Now we're going to sew along that little seam at a 6mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then we get to do this fiddly little bit where we butterfly the seams and fold our creases back to where they want to go. And then fold it in half again so that all our creases are back where they belong. Now this is a bit fiddly to sew. We're going to sew down the middle of this, or on the edge at 3mm if that's easier, 3mm or 1/8 inch. Now I use my zipper foot, and I do have to adjust or lift my presser foot a couple of times going around the loop. So there we go, a nice little loop. We just slide that onto the end of our longer piece of strap. Feed that strap through our rings, split the rings and feed it back through the middle, and then back through that little loop. So that is your simple strap. That's all done. What could be simpler? So that's the bag. Needs a bit of a press, but it all just sits just like that. And that's the JayMarie.